The May Davidson Award is awarded to individuals who have made an outstanding contribution to clinical psychology in the first 10 years of qualifying. Previous award winners include Peter Kinderman, Barbara Wilson, Sam Cartwright-Hatton, Emily Holmes, Gillian Haddock. Some of these individuals are here today. And all individuals have continued, since they've received their award, to make a significant and excellent contribution to clinical psychology. May Davidson was born in 1914, and she was a true pioneer in clinical psychology within and contributing towards the development of clinical psychology in the NHS. She was head of the BPS, chair of the DCP. By the time she retired in 1981, she had built up one of the best-known services at the Warneford Hospital in Oxford. She died in 1982. I'm sure she would be delighted at the continued success of the profession and its contribution to clinical psychology in the NHS. I'm delighted, and we're delighted, to be awarding Warren Mansell with the May Davidson Award this year. Warren's been doing research in CBT since 1994, when he did his DPhil with David Clark and Anke Ehlers at University of Oxford. Following that, he did clinical psychology training at the Institute of Psychiatry, and he then moved to the University of Manchester, where he continues and is currently doing research on CBT for bipolar disorders, transdiagnostic processes, and something we're going to hear a lot more about today, perceptual control theory, which is an integrative theoretical framework. I've known Warren for over 10 years. I met him when I first joined David Clark and Anke Ehlers' team when they moved to London. And Warren helped me develop a false feedback paradigm to make people think that they were anxious even when they weren't. So he had some really good ideas about deceiving people. And I was really not surprised to see that he'd written a book called The Bluffer's Guide to Psychology. Warren has actually written 4 books, and he has over 70 publications. He's currently running an RCT of CBT for bipolar disorder in Manchester. And on behalf of the DCP committee, we're delighted to be awarding this May Davidson Award to Warren in 2011. I'm going to hand over to Professor Peter Kinderman, who will present Warren with the award. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Jen. Thanks to the DCP, and thanks to everyone who nominated me for this May Davidson Award. I'm going to get straight on. I'm going to talk about the idea of enabling flexible control. There are many people involved in this work, both in terms of influencing it, collaborators, students, researchers, and practitioners. And I've just devoted this slide to all those people that are involved in the work that I'm going to be talking about today. So what's the plan? What route am I going to take to explain to you about this idea of enabling flexible control? I'm actually going to start by explaining to you why I think that disorder-based CBT remains the current gold standard for therapy. You may be surprised for me to say that. This is what we're going to start with. But despite that, I believe we still need a flexible therapy for services to be efficient. How are we going to do that? We're going to look and see what processes different disorders have in common, and then in turn we're going to look at what those different processes have in common. And I'm going to propose that that thing they've got in common is called inflexible control. I'm going to introduce to you a theory to explain control, and then I'm going to explain to you how we enable more flexible control with people in services. So, why is disorder CBT the gold standard? I've got David Clark and Paul Skowskis up there, both people I worked with at the Warneford who had a really strong influence on my work. The reason why they're gold standard is because there are a large number of well-controlled trials showing that disorder-based CBT works. Why are there all these trials? Because the time and effort has been made to develop these cognitive models of specific disorders. How have they done that? Through two things, I would suggest. One is this belief that you develop and build by an interface between theory, research, and clinical practice. And this is a two-way thing that continually you're checking and revising things. And Paul Scosis wrote a very powerful paper on that in 2002. The other thing that really rings bells with me, because I remember David Clark saying this when I was doing a PhD with him, what is the mechanism? These models have been developed because there's a belief that there are mechanisms that maintain and exacerbate psychological distress. And we're going to be returning to this idea of mechanism as we go through the talk. I hope I'm with everyone at the moment. Are you with me? Okay. Now, the question's often been asked, how well do these RCTs generalise to real-world settings? I'm going to give you an example of where an RCT generalises very well to a real-world setting. This is in the CBT for PTSD. It was developed in Oxford and London, and a randomised controlled trial showed an effect size on PTSD symptoms that was impressive, 2.42 there. Then the group in Oxford and London went out and trained local clinicians in Northern Ireland after the Omagh bombing in their PTSD model. And they were not part of a randomised controlled trial, they were not particularly selected on particular variables. They went in and they got an effect size that was pretty much equivalent to what they'd had in their RCTs. So I don't think the problem is in effect sizes. I think the question is about this particular kinds of sample. How often do people cluster together geographically, conveniently, as all having the same disorder? In real life, there are hundreds of different disorders in the population. This is the problem, I would argue, not to do with efficacy and application. So is it feasible that we could train thousands of therapists in hundreds of different models to apply these disorder-specific interventions, even though we know how well they work in this way? We also know some other things. In general practice, people don't attend the number of sessions we expect them to attend, with the average around 5. There's also some evidence that the greatest gains are in the first treatment session. We also know, and this has been stated earlier in the talks earlier about comorbidity, between 30 and 80% of patients have comorbid disorders, which then makes it harder to work out what the primary disorder is. And I think maybe one of the most fundamental concerns is that in clinical practice, people simply do not do standardised diagnostic assessments, even though that is what all the evidence base is derived from, the assumption that a person's gone through often an hour and a half or more of standardised clinical interviews. Now, I think these things are the thing that hold a boundary and give an advantage for a transdiagnostic approach. And one that's more universal, flexible, and maybe we can start early on because of these problems with attendance. I'm going to share with you a case example that I've anonymised, but it's one of a client that I've worked with, to illustrate this kind of conundrum. So Mary is a 30-year-old woman who works as an office clerk. She's on long-term sick leave with depression. It's the most obvious presenting problem. But on the first session, she reveals that she's had a food phobia since childhood, which is severe. She only eats a few different processed foods. She's had social phobia since childhood, and she has this now at work. She's extremely embarrassed of sweating in public. She describes herself as a perfectionist and having low self-esteem. So, should we be diagnosing Mary with all of the above disorders and problems, and using a protocol for each, or is there another way to help someone like Mary who is not atypical, who is typical, relatively typical? Are you still with me on this? Yeah? Okay, I like the nods, that's good. Okay. So there have been a few critiques of classification already at this conference. Often the critique of classification is about validity. I'm going to suggest to you that a classification system can be almost 100% valid and still not that useful. Classification in biology and chemistry is very valid, okay? It's very accurate. But is classification of disorders necessary and efficient for treatment most of the time? Imagine, for example, you were setting up a bird sanctuary, okay, and your job was to look after and help sick birds, okay? Which book do you think would be most important to give as a reference for the people that you're training in this bird sanctuary? Would it be the Spotter's Guide to Birds, which is the classification, or would it be the bird care book, everything you need to know to keep any bird healthy and happy? Now, when I do this in workshops, people say the bird care book because they assume that principles of caring are similar across species. And so are there common principles to helping people in distress? And I'm going to share some existing work on this. We have a relatively pre-diagnostic era before classification was quite so complex as it is now, with psychotherapists already being not making disorder-specific models. We have a period in the 90s where there were some very pivotal transdiagnostic review papers. The term actually came into the mental health arena with Chris Fairburn and colleagues in 2003. But this idea of across disorder processes is not unique to psychology. There's a gene called the COMT gene that affects cognitive functioning. It's transdiagnostic. There's the process of expressed emotion, which predicts relapse. It's also transdiagnostic. So the question is, what evidence are there that the psychological mechanisms that maintain psychological disorders are shared? And this was the question that Alison, Ros, Ed and myself pitched when we started our book, which is essentially an extended review article. It's a systematic review of cognitive behavioural processes across the Axis 1 disorders. We sampled the domains of attention, memory, reasoning, thinking and behaviour. And Alison was very particular about making an exact criteria for what we should judge as a transdiagnostic process. A strong methodology in the studies, that it's present in all the disorders it's been assessed, and at least 4. And in doing that, we actually, looking at the literature, which is a lot of work, found at least 12 transdiagnostic processes. Okay. Now, there are a range of implications of this work, so I want to share a little bit of that with you now before we move on and look more into detail. So, in terms of the impact of the transdiagnostic approach as it stands at the moment, as Jen was mentioning, I've got a self-help book, which is fears and phobias across disorders, and the Oxford Guide to Metaphors and CBT has got many chapters in there that are across disorder. There's been special issues of several journals, and I think the most exciting thing is that there are other international research groups who are taking this transdiagnostic approach forward. And I've got a set of references there for you that you can access. I'm actually going to put this lecture on YouTube so you can get the references for things later. Okay, well, let's take a look at these transdiagnostic processes. I'm not going to go through them all. There's so many. There's 15 potential transdiagnostic processes here. I didn't realise how they neatly fitted into 5 sets of 3, but it seems that they do. It looks very complicated. How are all these different processes actually related to one another? And what I'm going to suggest is actually they are very closely related and there's a core process. And what we need to do is understand how and why these processes are a problem when they're actually experienced rather than just a way of coping. So going back to Mary again, she reports that she suppresses her anxiety at work by trying to push her anxious thoughts to the back of her mind. She's constantly preoccupied by looking too anxious and making a fool of herself. And then we have Susan. Susan also reports that she suppresses anxiety at work by trying to push her anxious thoughts to the back of her mind. But she says, I manage this okay, and it helps me come across as confident. In fact, she's so confident on this slide that she's not anonymised herself, sitting there all brash. So, what's going on here? How is these same processes a problem in some people and not in others? And as I say, I think it's a single core process, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of research on this. This is some research that we conducted in clinical sample across all different levels of services, and at the moment we're up to about 146 patients, and we devised a scale based on the Harvey et al. Book. So it samples all the processes. Did a factor analysis, and it leads to a one-factor solution where 13 of the factors have got strong loadings on this single factor. That factor correlates with symptoms and standardized measures of processes, and that factor differentiates the clinical from non-clinical groups and isn't different between the self-reported or the team's diagnosis of these patients. So there's something going on here. I guess an interesting question to add to this is, does this process predict symptoms over time? And this is a study, or a series of studies that were conducted in students looking to see whether the core process predicts symptoms over time. And in this example, comparing a structural equation model with 3 different processes entered together versus extracting the common process and seeing which is the best fit with the data. This is worry, thought suppression, and experiential avoidance. If you put them in together, they correlate, but it's a set of modest correlations. If you put them in individually, as I say. But if you extract what they've got in common and then see if that predicts stress in 3 months' time, you get a much larger correlation. I should say these are the residual change scores, so these are about increase in the stress. So there's some process that seems to be predicting things, at least from these emergent studies. What could this core process be? I'm not going to go into any of these different concepts in too much detail, except to illustrate to you that this kind of idea isn't unique, that there are core processes that are sort of shared across different psychopathologies. And there are different takes on these, whether it's perseveration of action, impulsivity, psychological inflexibility, inflexibility of control, and some work in childhood that poor self-control predicts all kinds of demographic outcomes. Now, what I'm going to propose, and it is a proposal or a hypothesis, is that these do tap in very close to what this core process is. And I'm going to propose from this that the core process is inflexible control. And by inflexible control, what I mean is it's about controlling an experience without regard to or an awareness of the important personal goals that doing that interferes with. Okay? Now, that's the definition. We'll revisit it. What's important to note is this isn't just a form of avoidance. So you can control an experience despite the conflict with your goals, even by pursuing things like pursuing drugs or hyping yourself up and getting extremely excited. And we also know that avoidance as a process per se might not be a problem. If we avoid a car coming at us, that's going to save our lives. If we avoid the bully at work for a while, that's going to be a suitable coping strategy as well. So it's not just avoidance. What it is about controlling something that interferes with your goals, that then, as a consequence, has this disruption in functioning. And we actually know that disruption in functioning is a core of psychological disorders in the DSM, ironically enough. So, do we need to understand more about control? I argue that we do. And it's interesting, there's different takes on this idea of control, and it's quite a loaded term. Stephen Hayes says control is the problem, and my colleague Tim Carey says control is the solution. Well, that's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? Well, I'm going to show you a movie clip where the person, it's the movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall, and it's an example of someone trying to train his friend in jumping up on a surfboard. And I think he's assuming that controlling too much is a problem. And you'll see the consequences of that as he tries to train his friend.
Out there, I want you to ignore your instincts. I'm going to be your instincts. Kudu will be your instincts. Don't do anything. Don't try, sir. Don't do it. The less you do, the more you do. Let's see, pop up. Pop it up. That's not it at all. Do less. Get down. Try less. Do it again. Pop up. No, too slow. Do less. Pop up. Pop up. You're doing too much. Do less. Pop down. Pop up now. Stop. Get down. Get down now. Remember, don't do anything. Nothing. Pop up. No, you gotta do more than that. Just like run up a boogie board. Just do it. Feel it. Pop up. Yeah, that wasn't quite it. But we're gonna figure it out.
Yeah, that wasn't quite it. Okay. So I just like that film, but hopefully it puts a point across about control. Control isn't the problem, control isn't necessarily the solution all the time, but it's the right kind of control. Homeostasis is control. This is essential for life. Right now, you're controlling your body temperature, you're controlling your posture on your seat, and you're also controlling the blood sugar from what you ate earlier. Control is essential for life. It's also, in terms of behaviour, control is essential for coordination and movement and surfing, which we actually will come back to. So how do we understand more about how control works? I think we need to go beyond what we've been doing in CBT, go back, down, right through the third, second to the first wave and see what was going on a long time ago, before I was born anyway. And I'm actually going to pitch it to you on a specific year, 1960, and I'm going to propose that something happened then, or a couple of things happened then, that actually give us some ideas that help us surf through these waves that we've got used to in CBT. And I'm actually going to take us again into popular culture and talk about the Beach Boys. And the Beach Boys became huge in the States in the early 60s. In 1960, they were working on their debut single. They created this whole new surf sounds that they're sort of known for. There were two things that they relied on to do that. One was the feedback control in their amplifiers that created what's called the spring reverb effect that gives that sort of that wave-like sound in the track. And the other thing, obviously, was surf culture, which is all about remarkable control and coordination. Now, that's just happened to be that year. What else was going on leading up to this? This was an era where psychotherapies seemed to be much more distinct in their flavour. But in 1960, there were two papers that came out. One of these papers was called TOTE. This is a feedback control theory that's been used to some degree in psychology. In the same year, perceptual control theory came out. This was a collaboration between a control engineer and two psychologists. Unlike the TOTE system, which is a sequential step-by-step process, PCT, as I'll call it now, is a parallel analog dynamic multi-level theory. Now, I don't expect you to get that straight away, but it was, I think, very much ahead of its time. And I'll explain to it. So what is this idea of feedback control? Because I think this is integral to us understanding what control is in the first place. Now, this is an example of a control system. It's also an example of a mechanism. There's something called the fly ball governor. Now, what happens is these balls spin round as the steam pressure increases. The more they spin, the more they move up. That moves a lever which actually closes the valve that's letting the steam in. Okay, so as the steam increases, they go up, that moves the valve down, so the steam decreases again. Okay? This is what's called negative feedback, and it keeps the steam going into that steam engine constant. Without that, the steam engine would blow up, and we wouldn't have steam engines and the Industrial Revolution. So there's something about control that's going on in engineering. What I'd like you to think about is whether control is a way of understanding human behaviour as well. We've got very used to the idea of seeing behaviour as something that's a reaction to a stimulus or something that we compute as an output. I'd just like you to look at this video and think about that idea. What's happening is the person on the right is going to move a pen on a piece of paper, and their pen is attached by a rubber band to the pen of the person on the left. Okay? The person on the right is just moving the pen, and the person on the left is following some kind of instruction. And you've got to work out what instruction the person on the left is following. Okay. You had to think about that? Actually, you could just talk to the person next to you if you're sitting next to someone and say what you think the instruction is that the person on the left is following. Okay. Okay, I think you've had a little bit of time, so carry on. Yeah. Okay, the common answer to this, I won't do a rote here, but common answer to this is that the person on the left is either copying or doing the opposite of the person on the right. Okay, that's what we would expect if we're interpreting it by their behaviour, because there's this trace of their behaviour on a piece of paper. Actually, that's not what the instruction is. The person on the left was trying to keep the knot of that rubber band immediately above a dot on the piece of paper. So they're trying to control the location of the knot of the rubber band. So let's just watch this again. The rubber band is, the knot is not perfectly over the dot, but as soon as the person tries to pull it away on the right, the person on the left has to counteract that disturbance and pull it in the opposite direction. So what's going on in the head of the person on the left is not what the behaviour is. We can't interpret what someone's thinking or what their goals are just by looking at their behaviour. Now, there's all kinds of ways we can go with this, but I think it's starting to tell us a little bit, which we'll move on to. The funny thing, oops, sorry, missed that. The interesting thing is that psychologists were aware of this many years ago. John Dewey wrote about the reflex arc. What we have is a circuit, not an arc or a broken circle. This circuit is more truly organic reflex because the motor response determines the stimulus just as truly as the stimulus determines the movement. So behaviour is controlling the stimulation and the sensory input in this account, even though that's not what seems to be taken forward in a lot of the psychology that we do. Let's just look at this step by step. It's often useful to break this down into stages, even though it's a continuous process. We perceive some kind of state of the world. We compare it to our reference, our standard for that, the knot over the dot, and then we engage in some kind of action to control that experience. And it's a bit like having something that's just right, and we've got lots of these just rights in our heads. Now, how do we do that? We actually control something in the environment. In this case, it's the rubber band. And in this example, there was a person acting against that. If you're trying to stand up in a storm, it would be the storm that would be going against your ability to stand up. Now, this theory really expands upon this, so I'm going to illustrate this in some detail. These units are actually organised in a hierarchy, and this is how we manage complex things. Okay, so this is a really neat piece of video that illustrates how these units are organised. Okay, so it's only the outside, the lowest level unit, that is in touch with the environment. That's our senses and our muscles. Everything else is internal, and it's all about how we're controlling and managing those goals. With the idea that lower level things are concrete, about how we sort of manage our muscles, and we go up through sequences and procedures. But right at the top, we're trying to control much longer term things in our lives, like the kind of person we are, or the kind of principles and rules that we have. And this whole process, as I say, is dynamic. It's not a step-by-step process. It's just going round all the time. That's in the theory. What other examples do we have of control in real life? I would suggest that tracking a caregiver, following the person, this is Lorentz, in an imprinting study, maintaining proximity to someone who's going to look after you. Obviously, this is important in attachment theory, which actually is partly based on these kind of accounts. Another kind of tracking study is eye movement, when we're tracking anyone, like people leaving at the back of the room or whatever. It's a tracking process. So there have been studies looking at tracking. About 15 or more studies have been published, and they actually show that when people control and track something, and as I say, there are all kinds of real-world examples for this, it simply doesn't follow an input, compute, output process. It's a closed loop, and it follows this pattern that we saw in the closed loop diagram, that action acts against disturbances, so you get this very high negative correlation between somebody's actions and the disturbance they're controlling against, and actually they keep their input quite constant, and therefore it doesn't actually correlate with either the environment or their behaviour. Now, I don't expect you to get this straight away, but these papers are out there. it seems like a very sort of clear sort of confirmation of these approaches of understanding control. And it wasn't, at the time, this book and its previous papers were very well used and praised by key figures. Carl Rogers, Thomas Kuhn, Herbert Maurer, the learning theorist, and Carver and Shire in social psychology have taken a version of perceptual control theory into social psychology. The other thing about this theory is even though it's not hit the mainstream in any particular domain, there is all kinds of ways that it's been applied. And I've got a website that just links to all the different ways that different people around the world have used this theory. So it's one that is applicable to very many sort of areas, which I find quite exciting. So just to summarise, what are the tenets of this theory? It's that control is fundamental to life, and we control our experiences, and this is achieved by this closed-loop process of perceiving, comparing, and acting against something in the world. We organise control in hierarchies where long-term goals are implemented by lower-level goals. There are two other things in this theory. When a person tries to control the same experience in opposing directions, they get conflict, and this disrupts control. And you see this in all kinds of control systems. And then there's another process which is called reorganisation, which is the learning process in this theory. And this basically reduces conflict and optimises control. And it's perceived, or it's proposed, that this learning process is related to what we're currently aware of at any one time. So let's go back to the idea of inflexible control. What we're saying is that in inflexible control, the person's controlling experience despite this conflict that it causes with their higher level goals, their longer term and more important goals. So Mary tries hard not to feel anxious to the point that she avoids work. Or she tries so hard to not feel disgusted when eating that it disrupts her goal of having social life. And so what do we need to do with people? We need to enable change in the systems that regulate these processes. And I think this is quite similar to what we call metacognition at the moment. And we also need to help shift people's awareness to their long-term goals, their values, and their broader perspectives. So realising, for example, that a good working life is more important than not feeling anxious all the time. And therefore the person experiments with what we call exposure to anxiety. Or a person explores their goal conflict. They talk about the need to speak up at work, but also the need to not be rejected. And they realise that actually if they balance these things, they can be accepted for who they are, which is a much sort of deeper goal. Method of levels is a therapy derived from PCT that's transdiagnostic, that is aimed at enabling flexible control. It's an interesting therapy. Everything that the therapist says is a question. There are two goals. One is to help the client talk about the problem, and the second one is to ask about present moment disruptions in what the person's saying. And there's a reason behind this, or three reasons. The first is that if the person's controlling their perception all the time, trying to control their emotions or push thoughts to the back of the head, if they're doing that as they're talking, then trying to catch that process as it's happening is going to be a much more direct window onto it. The second reason is that people can start to, you can start to bring out conflicting emotions and thoughts to talk about. And the other idea is that it can sometimes bring out background thoughts, which is the longer term goals that a person has in mind that may miss if you don't help bring it out for them. Sometimes you can do things like asking questions which lead to that, which we'll talk about. It's an iterative procedure, it's open-ended, and Tim Carey and colleagues have already done several promising pragmatic case series of this work, and I'll expand a little bit on it. This is an example of a method level session. So the therapist, what do you want to talk about today? I want to talk about how hard it has been in getting going. When you say getting going, what do you mean? Well, I started trying to be more active, but I just get this voice saying to me, you'll never do it. Can you hear that voice right now? So focusing on the present. Yes, I can imagine the scared side of me saying it and sneers. I notice that you scrunched your nose up then. You're commenting on what you observe, not what you're interpreting. What was going on right then? I realise how much I can't stand this side of myself. Oh, you can't. Is there a side of yourself you can stand? Yes, the real me, which is different from the scared me. What is it like noticing those two sides of yourself right now? Well, it helps to see them both there and realise I have a choice. And the person smiles. What made you smile just then? I don't think I'd realised that before, that I have a choice. What makes that feel like a choice right now? Etc., etc. That's the idea of the therapy. These sessions pan out very much different in content based upon the person, but the process is always the same. How does this go down in practice? This is a quote from Phil McAvoy, who runs a low-intensity service in Salford, where we've been training their clinicians for the last couple of years to complement their existing CBT techniques. And Phil said, "Our techniques and ways of working have changed. We're less mechanical in the way we work by focusing on the present moment processes. Now the rapport and engagement we have with our service users is a lot better. The changes they've made have led to real differences in their lives." Obviously, we want to look at research in this as well. This is work that we've done in Salford Primary Care. So in 30 people who'd received meta-level therapy, in a wide range of transdiagnostic presenting problems. First, it's important to note that in those people that had finished therapy, we got a promising effect size, but this was just a subset of these 30 individuals. But in this research, we're interested in what actually predicts anxiety and depression from one particular session to the following session. And one key thing, if we think that this process is self-directed, is that it's the readiness for change. The fact that the person wants to talk about a problem and they're willing to answer questions about the problem. So we measured that. We also measured adherence to method levels. We also measured working alliance and satisfaction to see how each of these factors actually impact. And actually, the only thing that predicted symptom drop the next session was the client's readiness for therapy, the readiness to talk about the problem and answer questions about it. It wasn't any of these other factors. But that begs the question of what is it that predicts that factor? And there were two things. One was the working alliance as perceived by the client, and the other one was adherence to the therapy. So arguably what's going on is that therapy provides or facilitates this way that people are engaging in their own change process, which I think is really consistent with self-help, therapeutic alliance, and adherence to therapist protocols, which we know all work. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about inflexible control and bipolar disorders. Now, our model is a model of mood swings which cut across disorders, but we think that people with the label of bipolar disorder have this sort of archetype of mood swings. But we do see it also as a transdiagnostic model. The idea in this model is that people also have this conflicting attempt to try and control things. When they notice their, for example, increased arousal and mood, if they interpret that in a positive way, then they'll think, I'm full of energy, I can overcome all my problems. And so they'll try and get more of those experiences. If they appraise it in a catastrophic way, like when I'm agitated, I'll make a complete fool of myself, they try and suppress and downregulate all those experiences. So the idea is that then they're left with this up and down process as they're trying to control their mood, which pans out over time. It pictures an interesting question, and I'm actually using this talk as an opportunity to share this idea with you. What is it that tips high moods to an out-of-control state of mind? Because actually, sometimes when people are hypomanic, they report being at the top of their game, but suddenly this all disintegrates and they lose control. Well, we have a visiting lecturer here today, Kent McClelland, and he's been working with our research group and talking about some of the properties of control systems and conflict. One thing that they do is they increase what's called their gain, just like in an amplifier. They increase their gain when they're in conflict. It's a bit like if you had two boxers, they increase their gain and put more effort into their output. Now this actually improves control. So this is at a low level of gain. The actual desired goal and the experience are getting close, but they're a bit discrepant. If you ramp up the gain, you get a much closer match between the person's goal and their actual experience. But if you keep on ramping that up, you actually overshoot, and you get potentially to a tipping point where the whole system oscillates out of control. And this is a very subtle point at which this occurs. At some point you can regain that stability, but once you're beyond it, then you're escalating into what within physical limits is an out-of-control process. So this helps us, I think, characterise psychopathology as conflict, but in different kinds. So we have this ongoing conflicting goals where we can't control things if we're in two minds about them. So we're uncertain, we're anxious, we're worried, and we may have sort of subclinical mood swings. But at points we're going to increase our efforts at some point to such a degree that we're actually overshooting and curating the cause of our own problems, which arguably could be panic attacks in the short term, but manic episodes in the long term. This reaches real extreme levels where other systems are going to have to kick in and bring the person back down. And arguably, there are going to be sort of biological processes that do this, or drastic drops in the psychological processes, and we might see that as depression, loss of interest, and impact on health. Now, this isn't just a linear process, just like everything else. People go through these cycles according to the approach. Okay, so what do we do in terms of our model? We've developed a form of CBT called Think Effectively About Mood Swings, or TEAMS. And it's administered in a relatively standard CBT format. The first thing we do is identify people's goals. We're particularly interested in their longer-term overarching goals. We focus on their current problems, just like you would do in, say, anxiety CBT, rather than particularly trying to prevent relapse, although we would hope that will be our consequence. We help people experience internal states, just like you would do in an anxiety problem, and we help them identify these conflicting appraisals and their attempts to control mood one way and then the other. And then we sort of talk about this process of pursuing goals and and help them to pursue their long-term goals despite these changes in internal state. And in the long term, develop a healthy self-image, which they may come up with their own terminology of that, to enhance recovery. And what kind of evidence do we have from the TEAMS approach? We found that the appraisals in the model predict bipolar symptoms in a month's time, even when you control for various demographic and medical factors. We found that it's the high levels of both these positive and negative appraisals that discriminate bipolar disorder from unipolar disorder. It's not, interestingly, the positive appraisals alone that distinguish them, it's the combination, something about this struggle. And we've also found, in our case series, some encouraging effect sizes from TEAMS CBT. So that's led us to now do a pilot randomised controlled trial, as Jen mentioned, in Greater Manchester, where we're going to compare teams with the treatment as usual. So I was wondering whether I was going to have time for this slide. That's not been too bad. So there are lots of other things that we're interested in, and I think probably have too many ideas going, but they're ones that interest me and I think complement where this approach is going. So we're doing a randomised controlled trial of method levels, and we're also categorising method level sessions very accurately. Every question we're going to test its match to the theory, and we're also going to code client utterances to see if it fits onto the theory. We've got a model in development of the therapeutic relationship, because we're proposing that a collaborative relationship works so well because control is balanced, and we can use our understanding of control to get around mismatch between client and therapist goals. We're working on a model of anger across disorders, because anger is one of those forgotten emotions that's transdiagnostic. We've also, interestingly, got a form of method levels which is actually a computerized interactive text conversation, where a piece of software scans the text you put in for key terms around control, conflict, emotion, change, and ask questions about them in a method level style. And we've piloted this already and found that people report that it solves their problems better than the control condition, which actually we took from a computer model of Rogerian client-centered therapy developed in the 60s, which is also an interactive text-based thing. We've developed computer simulations of therapeutic change by modelling these hierarchies and looking at changing level of control over time. We're also looking at training service users to use method levels, and Sarah Tai and Tim Carey are using method levels with native Australians because of its real process focus. It shouldn't have as many cultural barriers as other forms of therapy. We've got a transdiagnostic group therapy for anxiety based on the theory. And we're also looking at, again, one of the most valid and evidence-based interventions, which is CBT for phobias, or even behaviour therapy for phobias. There have been some interesting papers that propose that this is actually a process of approach avoidance conflict to get a stable level of arousal. So we're modelling this using joysticks that can control phobic imagery, so we can help people to tell us what their desired intensity of their phobic object is, and observe this process of sort of going back and forth, but we've got all the data from it, it's on the computer. And we're also interested in goal conflict around attendance to therapy, because that is where ambivalence really impacts on our effectiveness as therapists, and looking at ambivalence towards therapy as goal conflict as well. So, in summary, the take-home messages are, what I'm suggesting, is that the processes that maintain distress are shared across disorders, that normally we're in control of our lives, this happens very automatically, we're not fully aware of it, but there are things that we do that are inflexible. When we do that, it can lead to conflict with our most important personal goals. And that, in the short term and the long term, leads to loss of control that's manifest in all kinds of mental health problems. So therefore, we as therapists need to enable more flexible control. We don't want to get people to let go of control completely, and we don't want people to be control freaks either. We want people to have flexible ways of controlling things that matter to them. That means having services that are flexible to clients. That means having therapies that are flexible to different presenting problems. And it means helping our clients to be flexible in their thinking and their goals. And I think that actually having a decent theory of control, which I'm proposing is PCT, aids this process. But this is a group collaborative process, so it needs other research groups to be involved if you're interested. And I'd just like to sum up this talk by a great philosopher that's influenced me over the time. This phrase, control, control, you must load control, from Yoda and Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, I think sums it up really. So that's everything I have to say, thanks.